So my name's Tim Ward, CEO, co-founder of Think Cybersecurity. And today I want to talk to you about security awareness and how we can actually try and quantify if it's doing anything useful. So traditionally, security awareness, we're really taking a more of a compliance-based focus. So have we done it or not? And we think that we can actually find ways to measure whether it's really achieving something. And what you want to be achieving, I suppose, is behavioral change and reduce risk. So why do we care about this at all? Well, lots of stats out there, but generally felt that about 85 to 90% of cyber attacks start with the human user. We know technical controls can't be 100%, so this is going to stay like this. And what we're doing at the moment in terms of security awareness isn't really doing much to stop that. And we've been doing security awareness for probably about 10 years now as a business, I suppose. It's existed, sorry, not as our business, but as an industry. And it's not really changing this statistic. This comes from the Information Security Forum, who did some research on this. So only 15% of users are actually changing their behavior as a result of what we're doing. Phish test train's been around for a little while now. We've got the NCSC starting to question whether this is really a good idea or not. If you get this wrong, your staff feel tricked and embarrassed. And I'll touch on this later in terms of some of the researchers, whether this point of failure is actually a good time to try and train people. And then how do we know if this is actually doing anything? So we've tended to measure this by completion rate. So have people done their training? Well, tick, yeah, we've solved this problem. And we're also looking at click rates perhaps, but click rates in phishing tests are really, really highly variable. Very variable based on the bait. And I know several organizations who, when they find that the bait is a bit too strong and they're getting too high a click rate, they just sort of slightly make it a little bit easier to get the click rate they want. And then you have to start to ask why you're doing this at all. You could measure incidents, of course, but that's a little bit late. It's already happened, and you really want to be trying to measure something before you get to that point. So what I want to do is introduce you to Kate, and we're going to go through a scenario here of someone who is doing their security awareness training. Now, you can tell that Kate is doing her security awareness training because she is sighing, she is clicking next, next, next. We couldn't animate her yawning, but she would be. The moment Kate finishes doing her security awareness, like the rest of us, she starts to forget. Now, this is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, and this is sort of generally felt by psychologists to be an accurate representation of what happens after you learn something. And really, within about 5 days, she's only going to remember about 20% of what she's being taught. Things get worse for Kate in that she now goes on holiday. She's clearly not thinking about security awareness here. A couple of weeks off, she gets back to the office. All that work has built up. She's got deadlines. She's being pestered by her boss to do things. And she's got the endless distractions of social media. And then perhaps one day, one specific day, Kate goes out for a drink after work. She comes back to work the next day. She's a bit jaded, drinking quite a lot of coffee. There's some very interesting cat videos on social media. And then she gets asked to do something by her client. Could you just upload this file to this file sharing site that you've never used before? I need it urgently. What's Kate to do? It's a really long time since Kate did her security awareness training, and we're expecting her to know what to do at this point in time. So let's unpick that a little bit in terms of kind of the psychology. Now, we like to think this is how we make decisions. They're all thought through. We're all very deliberate in the way we make our decisions. But the reality is only about 2 to 5% of our decisions are this kind of deliberative, planned action. And it's more of our sort of chimp or our lizard brain, whatever you want to call it. It's our sort of automatic pilot that makes most of the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis. So when you get that email in and you click the link, you're not really thinking too much about it. You're just reacting. And that's driven by cognitive biases, by emotion, and all sorts of things that are not necessarily fully in our control. So let's unpick that a little bit more. So what actual things might be influencing how Kate reacts in this particular situation? So one thing is this idea of availability. So if we read something in the news or something's really topical at the moment, then it's just kind of easier to access in our brains. So if she had read something about a hack in the newspaper that involved a data breach, she might just be that little bit more likely to be thinking about security today. So we can think about using that in what we do as well, and I'll come on to that later. Present bias is a really strong driver. So we're really we seek sort of rewards from things that are going to give us a reward in the short term rather than the long term. So there's a really short-term driver here for Kate in that she's got a client asking her to do something. So she's keen to please that client. She's going to be thinking about the present, the current moment. She's not thinking about the longer term impact of what she's doing necessarily. Priming is quite similar to availability, but if you're always sort of looking for some sort of anchor to hang any decision off. And so we can use that. If she had been primed by something in her context or someone had reminded her about something, then she might just be a little bit more likely to react in a secure manner. And context really drives how we make our decisions. So if you're working in the office, you're surrounded by other staff maybe, or there's a poster on the wall, all these things remind you about security. When you're working from home, there's no one else to ask. You might even be feeling a bit more relaxed, less professional. You're not dressed up in your smart clothes. So all of these aspects of context really drive how we make decisions. Emotion is also really important. And in this particular context, she's been sent an email by a client. It's got urgency in it, and that emotion is going to start to impact the way she behaves. And finally, when we learn something, there's a concept called spacing. So yes, lots of people do cram just before an exam, but it has been found to be less effective than doing a little bit of work here, doing something else, doing a little bit more work. So spacing out your education is much more effective at kind of building it up and building on that layer so that you increase your knowledge and your retention. So this is by no means all the different aspects of psychology, but it's just a few examples that are going to play into whether Kate really remembers how to act securely at this particular point in time. So when might have been a good time to help Kate? Well, fish test trainers I've talked about is a very sort of common approach. And the idea here is that you train people at the point they fail a phishing test. Well, some really interesting recent research where some researchers just very simply educated people on the basis of whether they had succeeded or failed in a simple task. And what they found was that giving feedback after failure was far less effective at people's retention and learning. And their theory behind this was that our egos just don't really allow us to learn at the point of failure. So we feel a bit tricked, we feel a bit embarrassed, we're just not receptive to learning at that point. Now, maybe after failing, a few hours later, maybe when you reflect on it, then it's a learning point. But at the actual point, and if you ever do interviews with people who've failed a phishing test, quite often they're in complete denial. They might even say, no, I didn't click that. And you have to demonstrate to them that not only did they click it, but they've saved their credentials. And so that kind of just highlights the fact that people aren't particularly receptive at this point in time. We've also seen some stuff at the moment where people are reacting to incidents, so maybe a scene-based incident, and then people are training off the back of that. Now, in my view, this is a little bit too little too late, but also you're almost punishing people with training, and it's very hard for people to contextualize it. So you send them the training, you say, you did this thing, and they're like, I can't even remember why I did that thing. And if you don't remember why, you can't remember the situation, you can't put it in context, and the training will be less effective. So let's step back from this. Is this really even a knowledge thing? And there's examples of where people who are cyber professionals, I think Ian Levy has been tricked, the sort of the tech director of NCSC. So it can't be a knowledge thing, because even experts get tricked by certain hacks or phishing emails. So what are we trying to do here? Is it compliance? Well, yes, we do need to tick that compliance box, but it's got to be more than that. Is it about expertise? I don't think so. We don't necessarily have to be thinking about turning all our staff into cyber experts. It's about awareness, yes, but what it really needs to be is about embedding habits, secure behaviors. So awareness is really just the first step. What we want to do is we need to change behavior, and we need to sustain that and keep that secure behavior going with people. And just as a slight aside, and not necessarily calling these guys the good guys, but they've demonstrated that we can steer and influence and understand people's behavior as they're using their IT. Now, they use it to show us more ads potentially, but there's lots of examples where the behavioral science behind this is being used for good. So steering people to do things that are essentially in their best interests, like sign up for vaccines, for donor cards, to keep fit. So we know that the behavioral science can help us make decisions that are essentially in our best interest. And we're seeing a real shift happening in the world of security awareness. So, oops, I'm missing a slide there. I'll come back to that. Okay, so we'd like to paint a picture of the future that looks a bit different, one of people-centric security. So the first thing to say here is that people come to work to focus on their job. Now, that seems a bit of a strange thing to say, but I think sometimes in the world of security we forget that. Other people aren't thinking about security all the time, and we probably don't want them to be. They've got jobs to do. They might well be making money for the business, which will keep us paid and in our jobs. So we want them to be able to find security really easy. We want them to want to do it or understand why it's important. But really importantly, they need cues and reminders. And these three elements, this idea of ease, motivation, and timeliness, are fundamental to the behavioral science. And I'll come on to that in a second. Behind the scenes, we want you as IT or security to be able to know what's going on. Yes, you need to see who's done their training, who has answered particular questions in a way, who's clicked through to more information. But much more interestingly, what behaviors are actually taking place? So who is clicking on links? Or are people trying to upload files? Are people plugging in USB sticks? And if you can start to track those behaviors and track the effectiveness of your interventions, you can actually start to get measurable security awareness and measurable behavior change. And this is where you can start to get a return on investment. This is the slide I thought was before that slide. So we're seeing this as a real shift in the industry. So rather than seeing this as a problem about learning and development, and it's all about training and using e-learning, it's more about thinking in terms of culture, engagement, and behavior change. And we're seeing people change their job titles on LinkedIn and seeing a real shift in this direction. So what's the theory behind this and what models can we apply? And so what I want to do is talk through a few behavioral science models that you can take away and apply aspects to in the work that you do in awareness. So what are behavioral models? Well, they come from scientists as an attempt to try and understand how we behave. They're a really good, useful starting point to think about if we want to steer people to do something different and more secure, where do we start and how do we do it? They do have to come with a health warning. Unfortunately, there is no model that says, if you do this to a human, you get this output. We just don't work like that. But they give us a really good starting point to think about how we can influence people to act in secure ways. So the first model I want to take you through is a model by a guy called Stern. And what he really majored on was the idea that context really drives our behavior. So he said all behavior is this mixture of attitude and context. So our attitude is like what we think we're going to do, how we would prefer to act in a given situation. And then context really drives and shapes what we do. And what he found was really interesting, which was that this attitude behavior link was really strong at certain times when context wasn't really coming into play. So if we believe we're going to act in a particular way, then we do. We follow through and we act that way. Unfortunately, he found that when context was strong, attitudes went completely out the window. And most of his research was in recycling and environmental things. And what he found was that everyone wanted to act in that way, but the moment it was difficult and it was just a bit confusing which bin to put things in, people just didn't do it. And so context is really, really important in driving behavior. And so we need to think about that in the way that we tackle awareness. Secondly, I want to look at two models side by side, and because they're quite similar in the way they work. So the first is a model by Stanford professor B.J. Fogg, and he says that any behavior is made up of these three things. So firstly, some element of motivation, sort of wanting to do it. And you see quite a lot of this in phishing attacks and the lures that people use. They're playing to motivation. So they're using fear, desire, social proof, all things that kind of make us want to do the particular behavior. Then there's an element of ease, or how easy is it to actually do the behavior you're trying to do. But finally, there's this element of some sort of prompt, some sort of trigger to act. So any behavior has all these three elements in it. So you have the element of ease, element of motivation, but something that actually makes you act. And so if we want to change behavior, we need to think about how to introduce these triggers. The second very similar model comes from the Nudge unit. So this was the behavioral science team that was originally part of Cabinet Office, now spun out into the behavioral insights team. And they came up with the 4 components of an effective nudge and their EAST model. And so first they said it needed to be easy. So very similar here to ability. It needs to be easy for people to do the thing you're trying to nudge them towards doing. Then an element of attractiveness. So again, comes to motivation. Do I want to do this thing? They then drew out this extra element of social. Now it's kind of part of motivation, but we are really driven by what other people are doing. And you can really use that in your security awareness. So if other people are doing something, you can say, look, other people are reporting phishing or other people are doing this. The famous example here was where people were highlighting people reusing their towels in hotel rooms. And if you just put a little sign that says that other people who stay in this room, because you make it really specific, have reused their towel, then it actually significantly increases the amount of people who behave in that way. So social proof is really helpful. And then finally, they also draw out this element of timeliness. So we've got timeliness and we've got context, which are both really fundamental to helping people change their behavior. A bit more insights from BJ Fogg, and he's got some great books on this. Tiny Habits is his latest one, which is really, really a good read. He talks about this relationship between motivation and ability. So if something is really, really easy to do, then you don't need to be that motivated. But if something's really, really hard to do, then you're going to need a lot of motivation to do it. And if you reflect on where behaving securely sits on this, it probably sits about here, where people are generally a little bit unwilling. Now, that's not because they don't want to act securely, but it's because they've got loads of other things driving their behaviors. In Kate's example, she had to get that document to a client. So we've all got other things driving our behavior, which are interfering in our motivation to act securely. So what Fogg would say is if people are unwilling, it's got to be really easy to act securely. And finally, Fogg also says that order matters. Now, as an industry, we have this obsession with focusing on motivation as the starting point, and we use fear and we scare people into behaving securely. What Fogg says is motivation is not where you start. It's the hardest lever of change. And I think if you reflect on the fitness world, so if all you had to do to be good at something was want to do it, and be motivated and say, well, I want to be fit, then we'd all be incredibly fit and eat really healthily. But there are lots of conflicting motivations. I might want to go to the gym, I might want to eat some cake. So these two things will interfere, and you just can't rely on motivation as the only thing to do. So what Fogg says is start with the prompt. If you could just nudge someone to say, oh, think about doing this, and you get the action, you don't even need to think about ability and motivation. So start with the prompt, then maybe start to think about some sort of making it easy, and then finally turn to motivation. So use this in that particular order, and I'll come on to an example. So let's go back to Kate. So here Kate is, she has done her awareness training, she's instantly starting to forget all of that. She goes on holiday, she's definitely forgotten it. What about when she gets back from work, if she just gets another bit of guidance? So commonly we talk about sort of bite size and drip feeding. So we're just drip feeding a little bit more information to Kate. And what's interesting here is she jumps back up to the top of this curve. And as she starts coming back down the curve, she won't get quite so low down. And this is that spacing idea where you're giving a bit of information, then a bit more information, and you've got this foundation that you're building on. But she does, of course, start forgetting. So she's coming down the curve again. She's got lots of work to do, lots of distractions. So what about if we intervene again? A tiny little reminder, reminding her about security. And what about if we make it topical? So this topicality relates to the idea of availability I talked about. So if you can link your awareness to things going on in the news, it just makes it a little bit bigger in people's heads as a thing that's happening that they should be thinking about. But finally, on the actual day of this incident, where she's really distracted, she's a bit hungover, what if at the point she's asked to do this behavior, what if we could intervene there? So she's asked to upload this file, she's about to upload it. What if we intervened at that point? And this plays to that idea of timeliness. And we said, instead of using this, this is the preferred tool we'd like you to use. So just to go through the sort of psychology of that, here we are making a decision in context, and there's going to be a trigger, as Fogg says, and there's going to be an action. And this is obvious when it comes to phishing. In comes the email, it's got a link, and you click it. So if we want to help people with some sort of guidance, well, we could get in here. We could prime them. So just before the trigger, you're priming people to think about something. So if you open your inbox this morning and there's just some little reminder about be careful in your inbox because of phishing, you're now just that little bit more likely to spot something. And we've done some research recently with Cardiff University, and we can show that this really does happen. Or you could get in here. So just before, or sorry, just after the trigger, so you've got the email, you're about to click the link, what if you could get in at this point and steer people to think securely? Obviously, your traditional awareness is over here. It's out of context. It's 6 months ago or 3 months ago. It's forgotten. And responding to an incident with training, well, incidents happened. It's too late, and you can't contextualize it. So just to pull together some of the key points there, all awareness takes place in context. So that's where we've got to help people and get as close to that context as possible. We need to think about making things really easy and actionable. So tell people how to cope with these things and make it really easy. They're not going to be particularly motivated necessarily. Social proof is really, really helpful. If others are doing it, then people will want to do it too. Timeliness is really fundamental as well. And without that timeliness and without prompts, people won't change their behavior. And annual awareness is clearly not particularly timely. So let's have a look at that, what that actually looks like if we try and apply it. So here's an example. Let's try and apply this to the world of phishing. And when it comes to phishing, what do we want to do? We want to help people sort of stop and think and avoid clicking on links. So if we apply Fogg's model here, let's start in the order that he says with some sort of prompt. So we want to be as timely as possible. In essence, we want to be saying to people, while you're in your email, think about phishing. Now, a reporting button can be really useful as a way of doing this. The only slight issue there is after a little while, you stop seeing it. It just kind of merges into the user interface. But it is a good way of just reminding people that it's a thing. Then we need to think about ability. So make it really easy. We don't necessarily need to befuddle people with all the different ways that they can spot phishing, because then you're trying to turn them into experts. And that's not necessarily the problem we're trying to solve here. So we need to make it really simple and give them a really good coping strategy. If you're not sure, report it. If you're not sure, ask people. And then finally, think about motivation. So help them with the threat appraisal, help them realize or understand that this is a risky thing. We find it really effective to show people examples of real phishing emails. And then you can use that social proof. Someone in the organization reported this. Have you spotted any? Have you reported any? So what could that look like? Well, obviously, I think Cyber, our Red Flags product, is all about trying to find these tiny moments where you can intervene. So in this case, I've got this email. Boy, that does look like phishing, doesn't it? But I'm about to click on the link. What if we intervene at this point with just a little nudge to say, are you sure you know this sender? And a nice big arrow making it really easy to look at what the sender is. Do I know this person? Obviously, there'd normally be an email address there as well. Or what about a reporting button? A slightly different mechanism here. This sits on top of Outlook, means we can keep changing what it looks like over time. So you don't have that habituation issue. And all I do is drag and drop, and that's how I report. Or maybe just subtly drip feeding a bit of information about phishing from time to time, but in people's inboxes. So I open my inbox maybe once a month, and I just get this tiny nudge from the top of the screen. Now, frankly, even if I just completely ignore that, and it goes away when I change screens, I have been reminded about phishing. So I've been primed. But actually, the ideal is I look at it, I click at it, and I get shown an example of a real phishing email. And here you can use that social proof of it being an example that's really hit your organization. Or what if we take it a step further? If I actually click on this link and I get to the web page and I start to give away my credentials, what if we can chain those two events together and say, look, you've just clicked on a link in an email from someone you don't know, and now you're entering your passwords. Are you really, really, really sure? And obviously you would set this up with a allow list. So you'd only be doing this if it was something that they probably should be being a bit more careful about. So let's go back to general engagement with our security awareness. Again, applying Fogg's model. So how do we make it timely? How do we think about this prompt? Ongoing awareness is critical here. You need your awareness to be taking place almost throughout the year, not just once a year. We need to think about keeping it topical, drip feeding it. Then we need to make it easy. So going off to an e-learning platform is not particularly easier with all the barriers and kind of what course have I got to do. So bring the training to them if you can. So you can deliver it straight to their device, make it really quick and easy to digest, and make the advice you're giving really easy and actionable as well. And then again, motivation. So different ways to help people. So I think Ian talked about it earlier in the main room, this idea of making it about personal security, making it topical, relevant to the news. All of those things make people just engage a little bit more effectively, and those behaviors rub off at work as well. Curiosity and stories are really effective as well. So playing on news articles can be really effective. I think I'm running a little bit low on time, so I shall keep going. So what could this look like? Well, very simple approach we take with Red Flags is just dropping this content straight on the user's desktop. And we actually do that in a really passive way. So it just appears in the background, and they don't have to look at it immediately. But it's then going to hang around for a couple of weeks. And what we find is we get 80 to 90% engagement with our content, which is a far cry from the kind of 10 to 15% you get if you send out an email and say, go and do your mandatory awareness training. So we can just get people to do it because it's interesting, because it's right there, it's really easy. And then if you want, you can up the ante a bit. So after 2 weeks, you can make it appear on top of everything and then sort of force the issue of people looking at it. But actually, we find that if you're forcing people, you haven't really achieved your aim. So finally, let's look at some more general behavioural triggers and looking at different ways of intervening. So lots of different behaviours. So potentially, I'm about to upload a file. So this has been the sort of thing we might deliver to Kate. Very generic nudge here. What we would normally do is tune that to the organisation to say, look, at this organisation, here's the tool we want you to use. So not only have you kind of steered away from the behaviour, you're steering towards the behaviour you actually want, and you're making it really easy. That here's how to use our secure Dropbox instead, and off you go. Or really simple mistake that happens quite a lot where people decide to send an email to an entire distribution list and they share that distribution list. So tiny little nudge that says, look, have you thought about using BCC? Again, shadow IT, so entering my email address into a browser, we can pick that up, maybe steer people away from reusing their credentials, away from signing up with their work email for everything. Lots of examples that sort of relate to DLP as well, so sending emails to different domains, handling attachments, and even things to do with social media, so different web pages or different thick client applications. So lots of things where you're trying to look for that risky behavior and find some sort of way to intervene. Now, obviously, you don't bombard users with all of this, and you're very sparing, and you run campaigns focused on one behavior at a time. So it's really quite subtle and quite sparing. And it really, really works. So we can offer you some really interesting insights as to what behaviors are actually taking place. But in terms of this idea of getting a return on investment, you're able to quantify behaviors before. So you can run all of this silently, see what behaviors are taking place, and then start to run these intervention campaigns and actually see that you have achieved something. So examples are where within a few weeks, you can see a reduction in people sending emails out to Gmail, and you can get really high engagement. So in essence, we're trying to move away from old school awareness. It's not always this bad, it's getting better, but it does tend to be infrequent, overly complex. It seems to either be boring or patronizing, and it can't be one or the other. It's out of context, and it's really not changing behaviors. Fish test train, a lot of people are doing it. The NCSC are starting to urge some caution here. You need to be really careful that you're not actually damaging the trust relationship you need with your staff. You need them on your side. And so some final observations, just worth repeating these. All behavior takes place in context. So that's where we need to be helping people. If you want to change behavior, think about prompt, ability, and motivation, and think about it in that order. Don't jump straight to motivation and scaring people if you can get away with just making things a little bit easier or nudging people. Annual awareness is really not timely. Nudges, think about this idea of making things easy, making it social as well, and thinking about the cognitive biases that we've all got. So we really can measurably change behavior, and there's some very different ways of doing that. We need to move away from this ongoing awareness towards a more real-time approach. Might have 30 seconds for any questions. Hi.
You flagged up the ROI, and your ROI is actually saying behaviour change. That's not quite the same as ROI.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, yeah, you've got to then turn some of those behaviours into financial. So I suppose what we encourage our clients to do in terms of planning campaigns is to start thinking about what's the risk register telling you are the things you're worried about, and how does that map to behaviour? So there's then a little bit of work to go, okay, risk register, how much does that cost? Therefore, what's the behaviour I need to tackle? But I suppose the whole point we're trying to focus in on is measurability. Really try and make this measurable rather than just, have we done awareness or not? Yes. No, it's a very good point. Okay. Sorry? Is that it? Stop. Cut. Thank you very much. Cheers.